So we are indeed recording tonight this lecture series, so it's really exciting. This is the first time we've tried something like this with the recording. I'm really glad to see you all tonight. It's really wonderful for you to be here. I think this is obviously an important topic, especially as we have Reformation Day coming up on the 31st. A lot of people call it Halloween, but of course we as Lutherans and more generally as Protestant Christians, we call it Reformation Day, right? So this is an important part of history, a very important part of history, and it's a part of history that I'm very passionate about. One thing that I'll say for myself is that the Reformation truly is some of the most interesting history. My undergraduate degree, I actually majored in history. My first love is history. My second love is theology. And so as part of my major in my history degree, I actually studied the Reformation extensively. So I'm very familiar with this period. I really enjoy it. And I actually wrote my bachelor's thesis on Martin Luther's views on the Virgin Mary. So that's a very interesting topic as well, but I'll save that for another evening. So a warm welcome to you to Martin Luther and the German Reformation. My name is Pastor Roland Weisbrot, and it is wonderful to be here together tonight. Just a few notes before we begin. I highly recommend that you ask questions. Please do that. Just so you know, there will be designated question times, though. So please save your questions for the question times. And then when you have a question, I would actually ask that you would come up to this mic and speak your question into the mic because, of course, we're recording. So we want to make sure that people that will be listening later can hear what the questions are as well. So if you just come up and speak into the mic, that will be good. You don't need to touch the mic. You don't need to move the mic. The mic will be turned on by Rachel at the back, and you can just speak in it, and it shouldn't be a problem. So please, if you have questions at the designated question time, please come up and speak them into the mic, and I will do my best to answer them. So, once again, welcome, and let us begin. Next slide, please. So we start off with a question. When you think Martin Luther, what comes to your mind initially? And this one you don't have to come up to the mic for, just shout it out. Sure, nailing the thesis to the door, right, exactly. What else comes to mind?
The Protestant faith.
Yeah, Protestantism and the different Protestant denominations. Yes, anything else come to mind? Very much so, yeah. Martin Luther's work touched on a lot more than just theology. There's no doubt about that. There's a lot of factors here. So moving on to the next slide, it's funny because a lot of times when people hear Martin Luther, they think Martin Luther King Jr., right? Of course, the famous African-American activist. I have a dream. That's what people think of. And it's interesting because, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was named after Martin Luther. So, right name, wrong Luther. So I just want to clarify from the start that this is not who we're talking about. So if you came tonight expecting to hear about Martin Luther King Jr., my apologies. I'm sure your disappointment is immeasurable. But we are talking about the German reformer from the 16th century. So next slide, please. And back to that question of when you think Martin Luther, what comes to mind? And I just have a couple things up here, that words that you could associate very easily with Martin Luther. We think reformer. We think of a revolutionary. We think of a theologian. We think of course, a German. We think of a professor, because he indeed taught at the university. We think of a monk, because he was indeed a tonsured monk in the Augustinian order. And we think of him as a priest or a pastor because, once again, that's what he was. He was ordained into the priesthood, and he served at churches. And, of course, he was a husband and a father. He was a teacher. He was an author. He was a Protestant. And, of course, beer. You know, how can you not think Martin Luther and beer? Those two go together pretty much as peanut butter and jelly, or as they say, or just about any other two things. And of course, there's a whole host of other words that can go along with the name Martin Luther. And they all make a lot of sense when we think about it, because this really helps to capture how dynamic this man was, what his contributions were, and just how much he affected the world, and he really did. And that's something we're going to dive into tonight. Now, one thing that I will say before we get too deep is the reason I called this lecture series Martin Luther in the German Reformation is because the Reformation itself is a massive topic. And it's quite frankly impossible to cover the whole thing in a short amount of time. So the reason why I've called it Martin Luther in the German Reformation is because we're focusing very precisely on Luther's life and work, and not going too far outside of that, because that will be more than enough ground to cover during our time together. But rest assured, the topic of the Reformation is so much bigger than this. And this is just a taste, a very relevant taste, as we prepare for the high feast day that is Reformation Sunday coming up this Sunday. So, with that in mind, we move along to the next thing. And I want you to look at this beautiful map. You see that? And I know you might be looking at it and thinking, I'm not sure how to make sense of that. To which I would answer, good, because nobody can really make sense of this map. This map, generally speaking, is a map of what was called the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Holy Roman Empire was basically a loose confederation of German states united under an emperor who was elected by some prince-electors, and usually the prince-electors would just elect one of themselves to be the emperor. Now, the thing that's kind of interesting about the Holy Roman Empire is it really was a hodgepodge. Different lands had different rules. There were different places that had, some had dukes, some had lords, some lands were considered duchies, some lands were run by the church, and the archbishop of the area would be in charge of administrating them. So to be honest, it was a really confusing empire. It was a really confusing confederation of all these German states. And this is the context that we find Martin Luther, because Martin Luther was born and raised in one of these states, Saxony. And so he was under the Prince-Elector Frederick the Wise, who we'll talk about later on. And that becomes very relevant because his situation protected him when he was being persecuted by the church and persecuted by the government of the Holy Roman Empire. It was his Prince-Elector that was able to keep him safe. And that's, once again, because of the incredibly complicated political and economic situation that was the Holy Roman Empire. And of course, the Holy Roman Empire today, if much of this land is made up of what we now refer to as, of course, Germany. But prior to the German unification in the 1800s, late 1800s, 1870, I believe, there was kind of a hodgepodge of German states, some bigger, some smaller. A lot of times they were at war. There was always people saying, this is my land, this is my land. And so, long story short, what I want you to get from this picture is this was a mess. Okay, it was a really confusing mess, and Luther enters into the scene in this confusing political mess. So, if we can go to the next slide, one thing that we need to acknowledge, and this needs to be acknowledged very clearly, is the role of technology in the Reformation. And one of the key pieces of technology, of course, at this time was the printing press. Now, the printing press was invented in 1440, so just basically half a century before the Reformation. And the printing press really was the age equivalent of the internet. This revolutionized everything. It allowed for an unprecedented amount of information to be copied, bound, and distributed all across Europe. And this was essential to the work of the reformers, such as Luther. Without the ability to spread their ideas quickly and effectively, the Reformation would have likely been snuffed out, to be perfectly honest. And I don't believe that it's an exaggeration to say, and there are many scholars that say this, no printing press, no Reformation. No printing press, no Reformation. That really can be an argument that's made. That is how pivotal this machine is. This machine helped spread the Reformation thought. This machine helped bring down one of the most powerful institutions in all of human history. So yes, there is a power to the press. So moving along to the next slide, thank you. So here now we need a bit of socio-political background for the 16th century. And the first character I'd like to introduce you to is, of course, Pope Leo X, or his Italian name, Giovanni da Lorenzo de' Medici. Now, anyone that knows anything about Italian history knows that the House of Medici was extremely powerful for a very long time in the kind of Venice city-states and the sort of areas that would have been known not as Italy, but what we know now today as Italy. And Pope Leo X, of course, was Bishop of Rome from 1513 to 1521. So right in the kind of time that Luther was operating, because of course the Reformation began in 1517. So Pope Leo X was the one that really responded to Martin Luther. And interestingly enough, Leo, of course, was the son of a wealthy and powerful Italian noble family, as I had mentioned too, and his papacy was marked by the extravagant patronage of the arts, namely in the form of undertaking the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica. So if you go to Rome and you go to the Vatican State, the Vatican City, and you look at St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Leo X was the guy behind that. Okay, he was the one that built it up to the magnificent structure that you see today. Now, when you look at that structure, do you think, man, that must have been cheap to build? No. It cost a fortune to build. And that's going to become very relevant later in our discussion. So keep that in mind. This is who we're dealing with as the Pope. And now, another important character I have to introduce you to on the political side is the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V of the House of Habsburg, King of Spain and Italy, Lord of the Netherlands, and Archduke of Austria. This guy had more titles than you could imagine. And to be perfectly honest, this was probably one of the most powerful monarchs, leaders that Europe had ever and has ever seen. He was in command of so much land. He had oversight over so many different peoples, and truly, he was it's hard to overstate how powerful a person like Charles V was. There was basically, after Charles V, there was no one that had this much command over this much of Europe ever again, essentially. Unless, of course, you think about, in our more modern times, World War I, World War II. That would be the only equivalent time where people had so much command over so much of Europe under one crown, or one leader. And so Charles is quite the guy, and he's quite powerful. And Charles was elected as the Prince Elector by the Prince Electors. He was elected to become emperor in 1519. And so he became emperor a little while after Luther, but he was the one that primarily had to deal with the kind of problem that was Luther. So he wasn't in power when Luther sort of started to rise, but he was the one in power when he had to start dealing with this Luther problem. And now this was a massive problem to Charles V, and he didn't like Luther at all. Why? Because Luther and his Reformation was threatening one of the key pieces that united all of his lands. And what was it that united all of his lands? A common Catholic faith. And so Charles V did a lot to try to stop Luther. He did a lot to try and stamp out the Reformation, but obviously history shows that didn't work so well, which brings me back to that conversation about the printing press, right? That's very important. Now, it's interesting to note, though, because of the complicated system that was the Holy Roman Empire, even though Charles V was the Holy Roman emperor, his power and his authority was actually quite limited. There was only so much that he could do because he was kept in check by the prince-electors. And so basically, the Holy Roman Emperor could only do things that the prince-electors would agree with, because if he tried to go outside of that, the prince-electors would say, well, wouldn't it be unfortunate if we withdrew our support? Right? And of course, you can't stay emperor unless you have the support of the prince-electors. So he only had very limited power. And furthermore, what didn't help Charles V's case is a lot of the German people and noblemen and noblewomen didn't really like Charles V very much. And there were two reasons for that. One, Charles V fought a lot of very expensive wars, and he liked to use Germany as the industrial economy that it was even in this time to fund those wars. So he enacted quite high taxes in the Holy Roman Empire to help fund all these different campaigns and wars that he was doing. And the second thing they didn't like, because, this is always a problem, he wasn't a German. He was Spanish, right? He was a foreigner he was a foreigner in control of their land, and they didn't really like that. They would have preferred to have a German on the German Holy Empire, Roman Empire throne. And so this didn't help. And now, to be fair to the Germans, Charles V didn't particularly like the Germans very much either. He thought they were quite a troublesome and annoying people. In fact, he is once quoted of saying, I speak Latin in court, of course, speaking of his royal court. I speak Spanish to my friends and lovers, and I speak German to my horse. So that gives you an idea of what he thought of Germans. So basically, he didn't have the highest view of Germans. He didn't like the German language very much at all, and he basically gave up trying to learn it because he thought it was inferior language. So needless to say, that didn't win him many friends in the Holy Roman Empire. But this man, and both of these men, are extremely important to our story. So we'll move on to the next section. So further background that's necessary is Luther was not the first person to say, hey, I think there's a problem here, folks. Okay, there were people long before Luther that started noticing things in the church that they started taking trouble with and said, there's something that just isn't right. I read in the Bible and I see it says this and this, and then the church is telling me this and this, and these things don't seem to mesh very well. In other words, there's some discrepancies here. And one of the first people to notice these discrepancies was John Wycliffe. And John Wycliffe, who lived from 1320 to 1384, was a philosopher, a theologian, and professor at Augsburg University. Now, Wycliffe decried the corruption of the Catholic Church in his time. He opposed the papacy and made his own translation of the Latin Vulgate into the vernacular, into the language of his time, the sort of Middle English of his time. And many of Wycliffe's ideas can be viewed as sort of proto-Protestant. Of course, they weren't what we would call Protestant ideas fully just yet, but these were sort of the germs of ideas that would eventually become prominent in the Protestant Reformation and, in a sense, eventually become key Protestant doctrines. And his followers were called the Lollards. So if you look up that movement, that's what they're called. Now, what's interesting about this man is when he translated the scriptures, the people in power at that time didn't particularly like that very much. So he was executed. Okay? So he died because he translated scriptures. So he was actually martyred in 1384. And then came another person, Jan Hus. And he lived from 1369 to 1415. He was a priest, a philosopher, a professor at Charles University of Prague, and the instigator of the Bohemian Reformation. Now, basically, Jan Hus came into contact with some of Wycliffe's ideas, and he was just totally enraptured by them. He thought, man, Wycliffe is totally right here. There's some big problems. So Hus basically denounced, followed very much a similar path as Wycliffe. He denounced the corruption of the Catholic Church and several of its major doctrines, and Huss was eventually condemned for this by the Roman Council of Constance, and he was burnt at the stake on July 6th, 1415. So once again, I come back to the fact that Luther wasn't the first guy to notice there was a problem. But Luther was kind of the first one to really have success. Now, what was the difference? Why did Luther succeed where these other two failed? Printing press. Because what was invented between Jan Hus and Luther? 1440, the printing press. These men had these ideas that were very similar to Luther's, and they were able to write them down, but of course you were still hand copying everything. Well, that takes an awful lot of time. So in order to distribute all these tracts, well, you're going to have some serious carpal tunnel, right? Recording all of these things. And there was only so many copies that could be made, so the ideas were not disseminated as quickly as what would happen later thanks to the printing press. But anyways, long story short, it's a dangerous job to be a reformer, because as we see, here was the cost against going against the power of the time. And now what's interesting, folks, is it's always dangerous to speak truth to power. It doesn't matter what time in history it is. It doesn't matter who's in charge. It doesn't matter what form of government it is. It doesn't matter if it's the church. It doesn't matter if the state. It really doesn't matter. It's always dangerous to speak truth to power. So that's one thing that we can definitely learn from that as well. Now, next slide is something a little interesting for you to consider. Legend has it that in 1415, when the executioner made his way toward Jan Hus with the torch, he said, "Now it is time to cook the goose." And that's because in Bohemian the word Hus means goose. Now, responding to this, Hus said, "You are now going to burn a goose, but in a century you will have a swan which you can neither roast nor boil." Now, why is this interesting? Because precisely 102 years later, Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, that famous event that we commemorate, and on Luther's family crest is a swan. So take that as you will. Once again, it's all kind of legend, but it's an interesting legend nonetheless. So some have taken to calling Jan Hus a prophet, and he may well have been, according to this at least. So next slide, please. So at this point, are there any questions anyone would like? And I remind you, please come up to the mic to share them, just so that people that are listening to the recording later can hear them. Any questions at this time?
What's with Luther and the beer? I don't know that.
Oh, Luther and the beer. Luther was a very famous, he loved his beer. He wrote a lot about beer. He talked a lot about beer. He spent a lot of time drinking beer. He spent a lot of time in beer houses. Even his wife brewed their own sort of home brew of beer. So beer was a real, Martin Luther loved his beer very much. So that's kind of the joke, and that there's kind of a connection there between Martin Luther and beer. Any further questions at this time? I know I dropped quite a bit of initial information, so.
Well, I was going to ask about the Lollards and the Cathars and the printing press, but you got there anyway. So.
Perfect. I'm glad I beat you to the punch. That's a good thing. I love when that happens. Yeah, so really right now what we have here is we've set the stage for what's about to happen. Okay, going once, going twice for questions. Okay, hold your peace then. So we move on. Now we move on to basically the main thrust of this lecture series, and that is going to be 3 areas of exploration. The first area we're going to explore is the question, who was Martin Luther and what did he do? The second area, what are the key documents and concepts of the German Reformation? And third, what does the Reformation mean today and how has it affected our world? So, we move into the next slide, which is entitled, Who was Martin Luther and what did he do? And this is just a very abridged timeline. Obviously, we can't cover absolutely everything here. We're just going to go through the highlights because if we covered everything, we'd be here all night, and something tells me that some of you want to go home at some point. So, who was Martin Luther and what did he do? 1483. On November 10th, Martin Luther is born to Hans and Margaret Luther, and their family name actually was L-U-D-E-R, Luther. Now, anyone that knows German knows that isn't actually the nicest word, because Luther translates nicely as promiscuous woman. So they're not entirely sure how the surname Luther, or in this case Luther, was assigned to his family. But unfortunately, it's kind of likely that some of his ancestors probably either ran brothels or were involved to some degree in prostitution. Because, of course, typically speaking, surnames came from either, what you did for a living or, what city you came from or something like that. Traditionally, that's where a lot of the surnames came from. But, of course, a lot of that is speculation. In fact, Luther resented his last name so much that when he became educated, he changed his last name to Luther to avoid this sort of negative connotation of his actual last name. And now he was born to a moderately wealthy middle-class mining family in Eisleben, Saxony. And on November 11th, Martin Luther is baptized. It was very common to baptize the next day because, of course, infant mortality was very high at this time, and you really wanted to make sure that your child was baptized before they died because, of course, according to medieval theology, an unbaptized child would at best end up in limbo, which is kind of this weird in-between place that people's souls would wait until the judgment day and then God would decide what to do with them, or they would end up in hell. And so that was the sort of medieval teaching on baptism. Obviously, we don't believe that, and obviously that is not what we believe Scripture to teach, but nevertheless, this was the popular belief at this time, so you better believe you got your kid to be baptized as quick as you possibly could. So next day, like I said, Luther is baptized at the church of Saints Peter and Paul, and he's named after the saint of the day, another tradition of that time, and he's named after Martin of Tours. So moving along from there, in 1501, Luther begins studying law at the University of Erfurt, according to his father's wishes. Now, one of the greatest ways to ensure that your family remained wealthy, powerful, was to send your children to school, to get them an education, and then to get them into one of the universities. And now, because especially at this time, there were very few people that were educated at all, even at the basic level, and there were even less that were educated at a higher level. So it was very prestigious for Martin Luther to be able to go to school, and it does show you that his family had enough wealth and power to send him to school, because that was basically the only way you were going to get to school in this time, is if you had wealth and power. And of course, why did he study law? So that he could eventually work in one of the royal courts and have a very comfortable, cushy life. So that was the desire of his family, to secure their legacy, to secure their high status in society. And so that's where he went, according to his father's wishes. Now we move to the next slide. 1505, and this is a very pivotal moment here. Luther is caught in a terrible thunderstorm outside of Erfurt when he's going back to visit his family. And the fearful Luther pleads with St. Anne to save him. Of course, he appeals to a saintly intercessor. Now, of course, St. Anne was known as the patron saint of travelers and safety during travel. So Martin Luther says, "Oh, St. Anne, please save me." according to the medieval Catholic mindset. And he promised, as part of this vow, to become a monk if he was spared. And so Luther survives the storm unscathed and immediately joins the Augustinian monastic order in Erfurt. Now, it's interesting because there's some people that argue that this event didn't really happen, that Luther just made it up as an excuse for him to leave law and start studying theology. Because Luther, as by his own admission, hated studying law. He hated it. He absolutely hated law, and he wanted to study theology and philosophy. He wanted to become a monk. That's what he wanted to do. And of course, Dad was like, no, you're going to become a lawyer. So basically, whether this event happened or not, Luther used it as an excuse to say, look, I can't study law anymore. I need to fulfill my vow. I need to join the monastery, and I got to start studying theology because that's what I promised to do. So basically, he realized that he couldn't argue with his father alone, so he basically either made a divine excuse, or this legitimately did happen to him, and Luther felt consciously compelled to enter the monastery after it. So there's a bit of debate on whether that actually happened or how it exactly happened. But long story short, Martin Luther ends up in the Augustinian monastic order in Erfurt. 1507, Luther is ordained as a priest and holds his first Mass on May 2nd. Now, this is very quick to go through the theological studies. If you notice, Luther started his studies. He started his time in the monastic order in 1505, and already by 1507, he was ordained a priest, which should give you an idea of Luther's intellectual prowess, his ability to learn things, and his ability to be tested on those things. So what you're dealing with here is a very intelligent person. And so he becomes a priest, and he starts doing his priestly duties starting in 1507. In 1508, Luther is sent to Wittenberg, Saxony, where he began lecturing and studying at the brand new university there. So basically, Luther is given Luther is really given quite an opportunity here to go and study these things, to go and lecture at this new university. And what made Wittenberg University so influential was this was the brand new university that his prince-elector had just built. Because at this time, everyone that had money and power was building universities, because universities were very prestigious to have, and all the princes and all the dukes and everyone that could wanted to have this educated populace to, one, supply their courts with competent people to administer the country, to administer the law, and also so that, of course, you could have the prestige of having certain intellectual thinkers. It was very prestigious to have schools that had particular specialities in different topics. Because, of course, right around this time, the Renaissance is starting to happen as well. The Renaissance, of course, being the recapturing of all this ancient knowledge, the old philosophy, the old art, the old literature, and it kind of bursts all back onto the scene, what we would call classics today. And so the university was very prestigious. So Martin Luther was very fortunate, and clearly this showed that he held a lot of favor in the Augustinian order of his area, because they sent him here to do this. So he was intelligent enough to do this, and he was also favored enough to go and do this. And furthermore, he was favored enough by the prince-elector to be accepted to this appointment as well, because of course the prince-elector, Frederick the Wise, had power over this and the choices that were kind of made there. So that's basically what happens. He goes to university to further study, to basically do doctoral studies, and to lecture at that new university. So we move on to the next part. 1510, Martin Luther is sent by his Augustinian order to go on a pilgrimage to Rome. Basically, the order needed some things delivered to Rome, had some letters, had some questions, and so they said, Martin Luther, we're going to send you. And of course, it was a great honor to be selected to go to Rome, because of course it was one of the greatest pilgrimage sites to go to. And so Luther was all excited about this, that he was sent on official business of his Augustinian order to go to Rome to deliver these letters, to do the business of the order in Rome. And of course, he was excited because he got to stay and look at all these different pilgrimage sites. He got to go to Mass at St. Peter's and all these wonderful things, which was, of course, just the dream of any medieval person, of any medieval Roman Catholic. So he goes to Rome, and he walks all the way there. He walks all the way from his home in Germany, from his home in the northern, in sort of kind of eastern Germany, what we would call today Eastern Holy Roman Empire, and he walks all the way down to Rome with a group of other monks. And when he gets to Rome, this was a deeply disillusioning time for Luther, because what he finds, instead of this holy city of piety and faith and all these wonderful things of Christian virtue, what he finds is kind of a hub of degeneracy. There are priests and bishops and cardinals that are in brothels, that are getting drunk, that are having orgies, and all these things. And of course, Martin Luther is just horrified by this. And then there's all of these relics and pilgrimage sites set up, and of course they were extracting money. They say, yeah, you can see the relic, but you got to give us some money. And basically people would pay a whole bunch of money to see this bone, or to see this piece of cloth, or to see this piece of the cross or something. And basically Luther was just horrified at all of this. And so when he came back from his trip in Rome, there was already the beginning of maybe there's something wrong here. And that was already starting in 1510. Now we jump ahead to 1517. On October 31st, Luther nails his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. Now, there is some debate historically as to whether or not this actually happened, that he actually dramatically nailed it to the door, or whether it was just kind of posted and then it was a later invention that it was nailed to the door. But assuming he did nail it to the door, there's a couple reasons why he did this. Now, in his time, by this point, Luther is a professor. He's completed his higher education. He's basically got the medieval equivalent of a PhD, and he's lecturing. And one of the things, of course, that you're responsible to do when you're an academic is you're supposed to do research. You're supposed to engage in debates. You're supposed to ask questions. And so basically, Luther decided that he had some questions. He had some questions. And so he phrased it as 95 Theses. And of course, writing theses, these short sort of arguments and statements, was very common at this time. This was typical academic practice. He wrote them in Latin, and then he put them in a public place, which is what you do as a scholar to basically announce at that time that, hey, I want to have a debate. I want to talk about this. And of course, he put it in Latin for a couple reasons. One, because of course that's the academic language of the time, and two, so that the sort of uneducated that perhaps knew how to read German couldn't read it, because that was actually kind of the point. This was just meant as a scholarly debate. It wasn't meant to include the common person. And so Luther's basically just doing his job when he posts these 95 Theses. He's not looking for a fight. He's not a rabble rouser. He's looking for problems. He's just doing his job. And he says, let's talk about these things. And now the interesting thing to talk about, though, is why he chose the place that he did to post them. Now, the castle church was the private chapel of Frederick the Wise, the Prince Elector of Saxony. It contained countless relics. Okay, Frederick the Wise was known for having a massive reliquary of hundreds, if not thousands, of different relics that people would pay to see. Now, what's interesting is about the date that he chose to post his theses. He posted them for a very specific reason on October 31st. Why do you think he did that? What happens on November 1st? All Souls Day, All Saints Day, right? Okay, because where does Halloween come from? All Hallows Eve, right? The night before All Saints Day, All Souls Day. So why did he choose October 31st? Because every All Saints Day, All Souls Day, whatever you want to call it, Frederick the Wise, out of his infinite graciousness and mercy, would open his reliquary for people to come in and view the relics. And of course, viewing the relics, according to the medieval way of thinking, would merit you some grace and would take some time off purgatory, perhaps purge you of some of your sins, cleanse you from some of your unrighteousness. So it was a great generosity of Frederick the Wise to open, but he only opened it up for public use once a year, on November 1st. So you see why Luther posted it on the 31st? So Luther was being a bit cheeky here, because of course one of the things that he goes after in his 95 Theses are relics. And so he's being a little cheeky. He picked this time. Now, of course, what Luther didn't know at this time is that people would take these theses, mass reproduce them, and send them all over Europe. He had no idea that was going to happen, and there's question as to whether or not he even consented to that happening. Some people thought that maybe it was just some overzealous printer that thought, oh, this is a hot story. I'm going to print a bunch of copies of this and send it out. So basically that's what happened. And before he knew it, all of Europe was all upset and in arms. They had read his theses, and some people said, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. But a lot of the people in positions of power said, I don't really like this very much. Because at the heart of these theses attacked a lot of the source of the power that was behind the whole medieval Roman Catholic Church and the state that was in many ways sort of in tandem with the church, because the church and the state sometimes were hard to distinguish at that time, and they had a very symbiotic relationship. So you attack one, you're attacking the other, essentially. So long story short, this didn't really make Luther a lot of friends. And the important thing to remember, though, as well, is that basically, once again, he's not looking for a fight. He's just trying to start a debate. And basically, he got a lot more than he had bargained for. He bit off more than he could chew without realizing exactly what he was biting off. And so we're going to explore the 95 Theses later in the lecture, more in tomorrow's lecture, and we'll just go into that bit by bit and explain really what was going on there. But for now, suffice it to say that's what's going on in 1517. That's the big event. And that event proves to shape the entire era. Indeed, it spawns a new era, because it's that date, more or less, that many scholars see the difference between the high medieval ages, as they were called, and early modernity. So, big deal, very big deal. 1518. So not long after Martin Luther published his theses, Luther was summoned to Augsburg to defend his beliefs in front of the papal legate, Cardinal Cayetan. Now, the Pope wasn't a foolish man. He really wasn't. So he sent the big guns. Cardinal Cayetan was one of the most illustrious and famous thinkers of the time. His knowledge of one of the key Roman Catholic philosophers and theologians, St. Thomas Aquinas, was practically unrivaled. His ability to debate and think was considered of the highest caliber. Basically, if you were a scholar, you wanted to grow up and become Cardinal Cayetan. This was the heavyweight. And so that's who the Pope sent. And it's interesting because if you read some of the journals that Luther wrote during this time, and some of his reflections on this time, Luther was deeply afraid to actually enter into this conversation with Cayetan. Because this is like you're an amateur boxer and you're going up against Mike Tyson. This is not a fun time. And so Luther actually said that this whole event made him very anxious. And it's interesting, just to give you an idea of what an intellectual heavyweight Cardinal Cayetan was, Cardinal Cayetan wrote a textbook on St. Thomas Aquinas and his philosophy and theology that was used as a common textbook through much of the Roman Catholic Church until the 1900s. Okay, 400 years Cardinal Cayetan's textbook was used. So that should give you an idea of who this guy is. And basically what ended up happening is this interaction didn't go particularly well. And Luther ended up having to had to flee Augsburg to evade arrest. Now, one of the things that was unfortunate, that even Cardinal Cayetan complained about, was he was sent under strict orders to basically ask Luther two questions. Are these your works, and do you recant them? The Pope had ordered Cardinal Cayetan not to get into a debate with Luther. And this was frustrating both to Cayetan, who of course loved to debate and was very skilled at it, and it was frustrating to Luther because he felt like he didn't even get a chance to defend himself. He felt as though he had already been told what the verdict is. There was no let's talk about it. It was just, you're going to do this and that's it. So interestingly enough, both Cardinal Cayetan and Martin Luther came away from this interaction very frustrated. And nevertheless, Cardinal Cayetan, faithful man that he was, did his job. And as I said, Luther had to leave because at this point now he was basically declared a heretic because he was not quite at that point yet, but he was in deep waters. Let's put it this way. Things weren't going good for him because he just said that he wouldn't recant of something that the Pope himself, Pope Leo X, said, you need to give this up. You're not going to do this anymore. And so that's what he did. So then we jump ahead to 1520. On June 15th, Pope Leo X issues the papal bull known as Exsurge Domine, which means in Latin, arise, O God. And it comes from a psalm that says, arise, O God, and vanquish your foes. Or arise, O God, and crush your foes under your feet. So basically, that's why he called it Exsurge Domine. Arise, O God, and crush Luther. So that was the reason for the title of this bull. And it calls for Luther to recant his thesis again. So now we have an official papal document saying you need to recant or else you're going to be excommunicated from the church. And of course, at this time, there was absolutely nothing worse than getting excommunicated from the church. Why? Because to be cut off from the church is to be cut off from God. Because it's to be cut off from the sacraments, it's to be cut off from grace, it's to be cut off from forgiveness. To be excommunicated is basically to be condemned to hell. So that was a horrible, horrible thing that Luther then had to face. And furthermore than that, there were political consequences to being excommunicated. Because depending on where you lived, to be excommunicated meant you weren't just an enemy of the church, you were an enemy of the state as well. And an excommunicated person didn't have the same rights or any rights at all as someone in full communion with the church. And so this was very, very dangerous time for Luther. And Luther even writes in his own personal writing that this was a deeply troubling time for him because he couldn't go against what his conscience believed, but he also recognized, I don't want to be cut off from the church. Because it's not like today, if you get kicked out of one church, you just go down the block and you're in another church. It wasn't like that. If you're kicked out of the church, you're out of the club. There isn't another church down the block. You're out of the club. And so this was deeply troubling to Luther, obviously. But Luther, being the sensible, level-headed, and even man that he was, responded by burning a copy of this bull and other papal texts that he found disagreeable. He did this famous burning outside of Wittenberg, and everyone chucked in a bunch of documents that himself and other reform-minded people thought were a load of baloney. And obviously, that didn't go over so well. That really infuriated the leadership of the church and, of course, the state. They were not happy at all with Luther at this point. And 1520 was also a year where Luther published 3 of his most distinguished works. And that was To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation, respecting the Reformation of the Christian estate. So basically, this is Luther's appeal to the ruling class at his time, saying this is why this needs to happen. This is why these reforms need to happen. And then the second treatise that he wrote, The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, where he basically argued that the church is being held captive by this evil institution of the papacy, and that foreigners are basically, non-believers, satanic forces are basically in control of the church, and right now the church is in exile. The true church is in exile. And of course, the last one, A Treatise on Christian Liberty, where he talked about the sort of freedom that comes through Christ and his forgiveness. And so those are some pretty famous texts that he wrote in 1520. Now, the next part we cover is 1521. And 1521 really was the watershed moment. This was the no going back, I guess we're reforming moment. This was really it. Luther is excommunicated as a result of Exsurge Domine and is subsequently summoned to an imperial diet in the city of Worms by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V to answer for his actions. Remember what I said? It's not just a theological problem, it's not just a church problem, it's a political problem too. So, of course, Charles V was pressured by the Pope, deal with this person. So Charles V says, okay, I'm going to deal with that. So he gets Luther. And of course, at this point, you remember, he was just freshly elected, right? Because Charles V was elected in 1521. He was just freshly elected, so he calls Luther to this diet and to try and deal with this finally once and for all. And basically, at this imperial diet, Johann Eck, who was a very prominent German Catholic theologian, was tasked by the government and by the church to question Luther on his writings. Now, the funny thing about Johann Eck was, compared to Cayetan, this guy was a bit of an amateur, to be perfectly honest. He was very famous in his time, but his thinking, his scholarship was very, very shoddy at best. And actually, a lot of Catholics even later on kind of discard him because some of his writings are a little weird, let's say that. And so basically, you've got a guy that really isn't capable of the task that he's been put up to, going against Luther, who of course was one of the greatest minds of his day and arguably one of the greatest minds of all time, theologically speaking. And so, of course, Luther basically just mops the floor with Johann Eck. And often, as a historian, I kind of think, what would it have been like if Cardinal Cayetan was sent for this task rather than Johann Eck? And the answer is, I think that would have been a far more interesting conversation. But long story short, Johann Eck was the one tasked with this duty. And it was at this diet that Luther gave his famous, "Here I stand, I can do no other" speech before the assembled authorities. Basically, it was here Luther made an appeal to Scripture and to his conscience and said, I'm sorry, I can't recant of what I said because I believe what I said to be faithful and true. That was a very defining moment. And so basically, by the end of the diet, it was basically a show trial. Luther was condemned and deemed as an outlaw in the Holy Roman Empire and all the lands of Charles V, which, of course, we remember includes quite a bit of land in Europe, doesn't it? Spain, Italy, the entire Holy Roman Empire, the Netherlands. Not a whole lot of places for Luther to go that are left, right? And so basically, he's been condemned by the church, and now he's been condemned by the state. He's basically in the worst possible position he can be in. He has no rights, and anyone basically that can find him and sees him is either allowed to kill him or arrest him in the name of the state. Really, really bad spot to be in here. Now, interestingly enough, in order to save Luther from execution, Frederick the Wise, who had come to sort of like Luther despite his heavy criticism of his own practices, orchestrated his kidnapping. He basically made a fake kidnapping for Luther, and he delivered him to the safety of the Wartburg Castle, where he hid, changed his appearance, and took on the name Junker Jorg, which means essentially Junker being the German word for knight, and just Knight George, essentially, is the name he went by. And he spent several months at the Wartburg Castle while everyone else was kind of calming down and the situation was calming down. And he spent months continuing his work. And what's amazing, and this is truly amazing, is that it was at the Wartburg Castle where Luther first translated the New Testament from Greek to German in just 10 weeks. He translated the entire New Testament in 10 weeks. Now, I don't know how many of you know other languages, but translation work is incredibly difficult and incredibly hard and incredibly precise. And the fact that he did this in 10 weeks is a testament to his ability. And it really is incredible at the pace. I've done some, of course, as part of my seminary training, I've done some Greek. I did a year of Greek. I did a year of Hebrew. Those are not fun languages to work with, folks, especially Hebrew. They're very difficult, but even Greek has its special parts, let's put it that way. And yet he was able to accomplish this monumental task in 10 weeks. It just always blows my mind when I consider that. And so we move along. 1522, Luther returns to Wittenberg. It's finally safe enough for him to come back, and he begins implementing the ideas of the Reformation through theological and social reforms. So he starts making the Reformation a reality in Wittenberg, and Wittenberg becomes the hub of the Reformation. It becomes that birthplace of the Reformation. And so that's what he starts to do. 1525, we jump ahead again. Luther marries the former nun Katarina Von Bora, who conveniently I named my cat after. So Katarina Von Bora, and she and Luther had 6 children of their own and also raised 4 orphans. So it was a busy house. Now, Katarina Von Bora was a very fascinating lady in her own right, and I encourage you to look into her history and her life. She is truly remarkable, a very remarkable woman, unfortunately outside of our time tonight, but I do encourage you to look her up, because basically Luther couldn't have married a better person, let's put it that way. This person was an absolute industrious machine. She kept Luther in check. She worked like a total workhorse to make sure that Luther had all the time he needed to continue his work. She was an incredible woman in every sense of the word. And so I do encourage you to look her up. And of course, this marriage was extremely scandalous. Why was it so scandalous? Well, a monk who took a vow of celibacy, Luther, married a nun that took a vow of celibacy. That doesn't look good for PR, does it? The public relations campaign looked very bad. So this was, of course, a massive scandal. And nevertheless, Luther believed that all these vows weren't binding anyway. And so that was the argument. And to prove that he believed in this argument himself, that was one of the reasons he got married, to show these things are just man-made rules. These aren't rules given to us by God. And so he did get married, and he and Katarina had a very loving marriage, a very wonderful marriage. If you ever read some of the letters between Luther and his wife, they're beautiful, and you can tell there was deep love there and deep care there. And also in 1525, on December 25th, the first Deutsche Messe, the first German Mass, which was penned by Luther, was held, and it's largely considered the sort of first Protestant service ever conducted. And so basically, what's really interesting about this is, and this is a fun little tidbit for you, some of the Roman Catholics like to say, well, we love the Mass because it's old and we haven't changed it, right? Well, here's a fun fact for you. Martin Luther's German Mass is older than the current form of the Mass that's used in the Roman Catholic Church today. Because the Roman Catholic Church uses what's called the Tridentine Mass, which comes out of the Council of Trent, which happened in the mid-1500s. So if you're doing a Lutheran divine service, it's older than the Catholic service. So there's a little fun tidbit for you. I always get a bit of a chuckle out of that myself. Anyway, moving along to the next slide. Continuing along. 1529, Luther publishes the Large Catechism. Now, this is one of his most important works and one of the works that Luther was most proud of. And this Large Catechism was basically designed to help educate pastors and priests to prepare them for the ministry. One of the biggest problems during the Reformation period that they recognized was a lot of these people that were in their ministry positions didn't really know anything. They basically just knew how to read the Mass, and that was it. because, of course, that's pretty much all you were tasked to do. You read the Mass, you do your funerals, you do your sacraments, that's it. You don't really have to do anything else. But these people didn't really know the theology. They didn't really know the doctrine. They didn't know their Bibles. And so Martin Luther created this large catechism as a training tool, as a pedagogical tool. And what's really interesting about this is even to this day, it's widely read by a lot of people, of course, in the Lutheran tradition because of its still value to this day. And I actually encourage everyone reads this document because it really gives you a deep dive into what really is the core of Christian belief and Christian ministry. It's a very, very interesting document, and it's not too excessively long, I promise, and it's not too excessively complicated. So this is a very important thing. And of course, one of the other problems that Luther and the other reformers noted in their time was a lot of the people that were in ministry at that time weren't in ministry because they're like, oh, God called me into ministry, or I really want to enter ministry. It was, I'm the son of a noble person, and ministry is a good, high-paying, prestigious job, so I'm going to do this. So there was a lot of problems with people that were in the ministry that really shouldn't have been in the ministry. And so what do you do with people like that? And so that was an interesting thing as well. And so the large catechism was a very key part of the initial Reformation and the Reformation as it continued and spread. 1530, the Augsburg Confession, which is essentially a legal document. It's a legal and rhetorical plea for Lutheran beliefs that was prepared to present to the Holy Roman Emperor. And it was written by Luther. It was primarily written by Luther's colleague and friend, Philip Melanchthon, who was in many ways actually even smarter than Luther, and that's saying something, because Luther was a very intelligent, very high IQ person, and Melanchthon was, in a sense, even more intelligent. He was, basically, his Greek skills were second to none. His skills in the art of rhetoric were second to none. In fact, he was so skilled at rhetoric that he invented a new form of rhetoric as well, a sort of hybrid form between different types of rhetoric that was very popular for a time as well. And so this is the guy that wrote the Augsburg Confession. And this confession was eventually presented to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V by Lutheran princes, basically people who had, the ruling class that had decided to join on with the Reformation and thought, yeah, Luther's got something right here. And this document was read to the Holy Roman Emperor by Melanchthon himself. Now, why wasn't Luther here? He's an outlaw. You shouldn't go to the very seat of power or the place that just declared you a criminal, right? So Luther couldn't go himself, otherwise he would have, but Melanchthon did go, and he presented this document. And basically this document remains the cornerstone of Lutheran theology. It's collected into what we call the Book of Concord, which is a collection of Lutheran theological documents which more or less make up what Lutheran theology is, what we believe, what we teach, what we practice. And so this is one of the documents that's in that book. And it's interesting because this document eventually was accepted by the powers that be, and Lutheranism as a separate sort of, it was treated as a separate religion at the time, but it was legalized in the Holy Roman Empire and said, okay, you can either be a Catholic or you can be a Lutheran. Now, of course, Lutherans weren't called Lutherans. The original name for Lutherans was evangelical Catholics. Yes, that was the term that they called themselves. And of course, evangelical, not in the term that you know today associated with like the evangelicals, fundamentalists, that kind of thing, but evangelical, of course, referring to the Greek term for gospel. So basically, it's like, for no better words, gospel Catholics. And so that was actually the original title of what Lutherans called themselves. And of course, the name Lutheran stuck because that was the pejorative that was used basically against Lutherans. They said, well, you're a Lutheran, which of course was an insult because there was only one church, and to be called something other than Catholic, because Catholic meant universal. That's what that word means. To be called something other than that is basically to be called a heretic. And so basically, For better or worse, the name stuck, and now we're called Lutherans. But I commend to you the fact that we were originally called Evangelical Catholics. And that's why, actually, if you get a copy of the Book of Concord, depending on the edition, it says the Confessions of the Evangelical Catholic Church, which is very interesting. So, we'll touch on this Augsburg Confession a little bit later as well, tomorrow in tomorrow's lecture. So we'll dive into that a bit. Next slide, please. In 1533, the Kligsha Gesangbuch, the Klug Songbook, is published and includes many hymns from Luther, such as "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." One of the biggest things of the Reformation was new music coming into the church, music that was sung in German. So goodbye Latin chants, goodbye a bunch of stuff that no one could understand, and hello music that people could actually hear and understand and learn from. And what's interesting to think about, though, especially at this time, is music wasn't so much associated with worship as it was a pedagogical tool. So one thing that you will notice among a lot of the Reformation hymns is a lot of them are deeply theological. And that's because the Reformers realized that the best way to get everyone to learn these things is to put them to song. Because, of course, the average level of education wasn't exactly high. We're dealing with uneducated peasants here, many of whom couldn't read or write. So what's the best way to get these things into their minds? Music. So that's a very interesting thing to note. And so music was and continues to be a powerful force for the dissemination of theology. And even before that it was, but especially in the Reformation, they really took hold of that. 1537, the town of Smalkalden hosts a meeting of the Smalkalden League rulers and theologians. And at this meeting, Luther presents his Articles of Faith, which summarize the Lutheran doctrine. And these are also in the Book of Concord. They're basically called the Smalcald Articles. And this was basically just a way of summarizing, okay, here's what we believe. And people could rally around this. So if someone asked you, what did you believe? This was a quick and easy way of saying, this is what I believe. So that was a pretty important document as well. And we could go a little bit deeper into that, but once again, that's outside of the scope of what we're dealing with tonight. Obviously, there's so much more to be said on so many of these different things. Finally, in 1546, Martin Luther dies in Eisleben, the very town he was born in. And during a trip to help mediate, ironically, a conflict between two officials, he died at that time, and Luther is returned to Wittenberg and buried at the Castle Church. And as you can see on the picture here, it's a little dark, but basically there is his gravestone, which is at the bottom there, and right above him is the pulpit in the church. And it's actually kind of fitting that he was buried there, because the Reformation, as some scholars have said, is really a reformation of preaching and proclamation. And so it's very fitting that Luther was placed in the church where it all started, where he posted the thesis, under the pulpit. So, in many ways, very, very fitting place for Luther to rest, and that's, of course, where he rests to this day. So, next slide, please. We come to another Q&A session, and this is going to be our last Q&A session. We've covered all the material that we're going through tonight, so please come with your questions.
Well,
Thank you.
I feel, if everyone will forgive me for maybe not knowing some basic Protestant theology here, I'm interested in what you were talking about with his marriage. They both took the vows of celibacy. What do Lutherans and Protestants believe when it comes to what Paul said about celibacy?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because, of course, even Jesus himself actually says that the more blessed estate is singleness. And the reason why both Jesus and Paul reiterates Jesus on this, is because when you're not bound to a partner in life, you can devote yourself more clearly and more singularly to God, right? And so that's the idea, is that if you're unmarried, you can spend all your time just worrying about the church, doing the works of being a Christian, praying, meditating, all that stuff. Because, of course, what happens when you have a family? Things get busy, right? Now, what's important to note is basically Martin Luther and the early Protestants recognized that this indeed was what Jesus and Paul were saying. And they didn't necessarily take a problem with that. The issue became the Catholic Church at the time, the medieval Catholic Church at the time, had taken it to the absolute extreme and basically made marriage almost to an extent something dirty, or something lesser. It's like, ugh, you're married, right? You know, how unholy of you, right? And so basically, Luther and crew offered a corrective to that and said there's nothing wrong with the estate of marriage. God instituted marriage as well. And for the vast majority of people, marriage is the estate to which you should be in. The call to celibacy, the call to singleness, is a grace given to only some people. And so basically what they took problem with was the Roman Catholic Church mandating something that shouldn't have been mandated. They saw it as a valid thing. They saw it as valid lifestyle. They definitely acknowledged the virtues of singleness and remaining unmarried, but they took problem with turning it into a rule. So, and interestingly enough, just a little backstory for that, the reason originally that the Roman Catholic Church instituted celibacy for its clergy was to prevent people from entering clerical positions like a bishop or a priest and passing that title down to their children. Because that was a very big problem in the medieval age, was you would become a bishop or whatever, and then you'd have a kid, and then instead of a different person being elected bishop, you just give it to your son. And of course, as we know, sometimes the firstborn child isn't always the best choice for the position, right? So basically the way to stop this from happening, the church said, no problem, you can't have kids. Now, what's very interesting is throughout the medieval church, the clergy was plagued with problems of people having concubines and children out of wedlock anyway. It's not like there was this big pious group of people that, were staying celibate. You know, as I discussed earlier, there were many that were engaged in what would be considered a very degenerate behavior, yeah. Or at the very least, not in keeping with Christian teaching on sexuality. Any other questions? I hope that answered your yeah.
This isn't a question so much, well, it is in a sense, and I'd like to thank you for the lecture. It's been incredibly interesting, but you said this was being recorded.
Yes.
So can we get it on website is basically what I'm looking for.
Yeah, so basically we have recorded it tonight, and I will be uploading it after we finish the second lecture series. I'll upload both, and they'll be made available. I'll make sure links are sent out. Yeah.
I know I have more questions, but I haven't thought of them yet.
Yeah, well, no worries. Even if you think of them overnight, and if you come tomorrow too, you can ask them that as well. Yeah. Any other questions? We still have we still have a good 15 minutes left if we want, folks, so please, large or small, bring them all.
I don't want to downplay the translation,
Yeah.
but what languages was Luther fluent in? Because it seemed to me that 10 weeks is amazing.
Yes.
But he would have been very fluent in both those languages, so he wouldn't have had to struggle very much because it's not like he was just learning.
No, certainly not, because of course part of the curriculum of his time, universities had really started focusing on languages, especially the ancient languages like Greek and Hebrew as well, and of course Latin was drilled into him from being a boy. So basically he was fluent in German of his time, which of course isn't perfectly equivalent to the German that's spoken today. It's kind of like a middle high German. And then he would have been fluent, of course, in Latin, fluent in Greek, fluent in Hebrew.
So all he had was time, so he could really speed it up.
Yes,
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, that helped. I mean, he was locked away in the Wartburg Castle wasn't exactly party central, so he had a lot of free time to do these translations. So yeah, absolutely. Any other questions or comments or anything perhaps someone thought was interesting or liked that they'd like to share?
I'll give you another one.
Sure, hit me.
When I was in Romania volunteering on an archaeological dig site, before they started the dig, they just kind of went around to the villages and stuff and asked what people in the area knew about this thing that to an archaeologist, it's called a tell, right? It's an artificial hill that's been built up over centuries and stuff, people living there. So to an archaeologist, you could tell that it was clearly inhabited, but to a person, it's just a hill in that field, right? And so they asked the locals, and they kind of had the impression that it was haunted. And what they found when they started digging was there was, I believe, an 18th century children's graveyard. So it had this reputation of being haunted because I guess the Orthodox belief, or this was relayed to me by the archaeologist I was working with, was unbaptized children became ghosts. So that's where my mind went when you talked about him getting baptized the next day.
Yeah.
So was there a bit of a ghost element to that too, or was that more of an Eastern thing?
So
Because you talked about purgatory or hell, and I'm not sure how ghosts fit into Christianity at all. So
sure. So thank you for that question. There's a few points there, so I'll try to address them all. And forgive me if I forgot parts of your question, but I'll try to hit them all. So basically, the first thing that we need to do is to delineate between the official teaching of the church, what the church actually taught, and then what the people on the ground believed. So in other words, magisterial doctrine and popular doctrine, right? So basically, of course, there was a lot of popular belief in different spirits, in different demons, in ghosts, in vampire, whatever, you name it, right? Throughout human history, there's been this sort of idea that there's these spiritual beings or these kind of spooky things that are doing all these evil things. So my guess is that probably in that area, the popular belief was these people became ghosts. That's not actually the teaching, of course, of the Eastern Orthodox Church, but once again, you know how it happens. People start to get different ideas, they become popular, and then all of a sudden everyone believes them, right? And so basically that's what would happen there. As for what the case was, of course...
Even Christians talk about demons, right?
Oh, totally. And yeah, exactly. And now the question is, of course, Christians affirm that there is a spiritual realm. The only debate is, how much do those things interact, right? So now the question is, and of course, a lot of our conceptions of what demons are just popular conceptions. Like the devil's probably not a little red dude with a pitchfork and some horns on his head and a tail, right? Like that's probably not what he looks like, right? But what's interesting is a medieval conception of Satan was actually as a goat. So, I mean, even the conceptions of what is demonic have changed over time, right? So there's that element as well. But basically, the Roman Catholic teaching for people that were unbaptized, especially infants, or infants or perhaps you died in the womb, or you died something very young, whatever, you weren't baptized. The Roman Catholic Church said, well, there's no guarantee that you went straight to hell, but they basically created this kind of other place called limbo. And like I said at the beginning, limbo is essentially just this place where you're not in heaven, you're not in hell, you're not in purgatory, but it's just kind of this place of waiting until God returns and then says, decides basically, what am I going to do with you? Right? It's basically a holdover, a place to wait until Judgment Day. And now, of course, the Lutherans and the Protestants say purgatory doesn't exist, limbo doesn't exist. There's only two places. Those places are heaven, those places are hell. And now the Lutheran position would be that there's no guarantee that an unbaptized person is a one-way ticket to hell. But that being said, there is still an emphasis, at least in the Lutheran tradition, as well as several other Protestant traditions, that you really should be baptized, because baptism is, of course, a chief means of grace, a way in which we're regenerated by water and the Holy Spirit. And so the question becomes, why wouldn't you want that regeneration, right? So that would be more the position. So it's not like that harsh idea that you're not baptized, your kid dies, sorry, they're going to hell, or sorry, they're in limbo. There's not that idea, but it's definitely still encouraged. It's definitely still something. As you'll notice in our tradition, it's not very uncommon, even to this day, to have your child baptized within a couple weeks of them being born, right? So basically, the minute your child is healthy and stable, you bring him to church, you bring her to church, you get him baptized. That's still very common, and there's a reason for that, right? Although, unfortunately, there still are a lot of popular misconceptions that oh, if I don't baptize Pumpkin, this is going to be a problem, right? But that's not necessarily true. Yeah, I hope that clarifies it. Yes, come on up. You're the next contestant on Can You Stump Pastor Roland? Yeah, probably.
That'll be impossible.
Oh, no, that's
know
not
you
that
too
hard.
You had mentioned that Luther had to go to, or that he was kidnapped. Mm-hmm. Was that still in Charles's domain area of rule? Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, so here's what's interesting. Remember when, you might not have been here yet, but earlier on, we showed this map of the Holy Roman Empire. And the Holy Roman Empire, as I had explained earlier, is basically this hodgepodge of little micro-states and larger states and duchies and bishoprics and all these different things jammed into this one sort of loosely formed coalition empire. And basically what happened was, even though Charles V was emperor, the real power resided in the localities. So basically, even though Luther was declared a fugitive at, say, the federal level, at the state level, it depended on whether or not the prince or the local ruler was like, oh, I'll follow that directive or not. So in Luther's case, Frederick the Wise basically was like, I don't care what Charles says. Yeah. And he had enough power and influence to be able to do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
The question I had there was, is the church that he nailed the 95 Theses to, is that still standing to this day?
It is. You can visit it if you go to Wittenberg. And actually, the German government, for the 500th year of the Reformation, just spent hundreds of millions of dollars totally restoring Wittenberg. So it's actually quite beautiful. Yeah. Highly recommend, if you can at one point in your life, it's definitely worth the time to go. It's a fascinating historical site. Yeah. Any other questions? Judy coming forward. Man, you got the clipboard and everything.
I have a bunch, but I think you answered it. There's no doubt that Luther was protected by God because they had executed everybody else. But he did go back to Wittenberg, of all places. So how did he know it was safe to return? Because you said he went back to Wittenberg when it was safe to return. So there was a different power then?
So basically what happened was Luther's prince-elector more or less came out and said, as long as you're in my land, I'm not going to follow the imperial edict, you're safe.
So the same thing, he didn't care what Charles said.
Yeah,
Charles was still in power.
Basically. So, and the other thing that happened is, the one thing, when you zoom out, there was a lot going on in the 1500s in terms of different wars. So Charles didn't exactly have every moment of every day to bother himself with the whole Lutheran problem, right?
That's what I thought it might mean, that he wasn't front page news anymore.
No.
And so everybody was just distracted with other things.
Well, think about how fast the stories change these days,
That's
right?
exactly what occurred to me when you said that.
Yeah.
I thought, oh, he's not the big problem anymore. He's still a problem,
Yeah.
but not the big problem.
Exactly, because of course at this point you got to remember the biggest existential threat at this point was the Ottoman Turks were making their way deeper and deeper into Europe. Oh. And so all the Western Europeans were like, that's a problem. And so a lot of the focus was actually on that. So in Charles's mind, Luther was a small problem. He was a small fish in a huge pond. Okay. Obviously, history shows that he wasn't such a small fish after all, but at the time, from Charles's perspective, he didn't have time to worry himself about what some monk and professor said about theology. He had bigger fish to fry.
And what about the Pope? Was it still the same Pope? And how come he didn't have to deal with it?
Well, Pope Leo X died in 1521, and the next pope that took over did try to continue to sort of counteract Luther, but of course this also showed that the papacy didn't have ultimate power in certain areas. By this point already in Germany, the Catholic Church wasn't as strong as it used to be, and that was largely because the Catholic Church spent about 200, the Roman Pope, the papacy was transferred to France for about 200 years, and what is known as the Avignon papacy. And basically, the Pope spent about 200 years as the puppet of the King of France. So that really soured other countries' relationships with the papacy. So basically, a lot of them, by this point, a lot of the Germans are like, I don't really care what the Pope says because he's just, he's just an Italian agent, or he's just a French agent, or he's just a Spanish agent. Who cares what he says? So even at this point, the papacy was weakening in a place like Germany. Of course, there was still immense power, but not absolute power.
So when Luther returned to Wittenberg, where was the movement at then? Like, was it really big? Like, my thought was that, like Caiaphas and the fellows, this movement is too big now, so we're going to have to do this at night, underground, So I thought maybe the Reformation had grown in such size that they thought, we can't win. We don't want to die on this hill.
Well, and that's basically exactly what happened, because by the time Luther returns to Wittenberg, he had plenty of followers and plenty of people that believed in what he was doing, so they were continuing his work, right? They were publishing his works, they were writing their own stuff, they were having it sent all over the place. So by this point, Wittenberg was hardly the only one on board with the Reformation. There were several other theologians and pastors and scholars and princes and different people from all across Europe that were starting to sort of wake up to this and say, maybe this guy's got a point here.
Isn't that interesting, that Nelson Mandela just came to my mind, because Luther is out of the picture, just like other leaders have been that have been put in prison, but their work continues.
Well, exactly, and that's literally the same thing that happened. Is they put him in jail, he put himself in self-exile to protect himself, but it didn't stop.
Neat.
Yeah.
Thanks. I think that's everything.
Yeah, and of course, that's because of the printing press, right? I can't emphasize that enough. The printing press was the one that really made this go from a small movement in Wittenberg to a truly European movement in a very short amount of time. Because it was within weeks that people in Holland were reading this, people in Denmark were reading this, people in Italy were reading this, people in Spain were reading this, people in England were reading this. It was going all over the place, Switzerland, France, and that happened within a matter of weeks and months, thanks to the printing press. And, it was funny because one of the things that the Roman Catholic Church did to try and curb down the Reformation was ban printing presses in Catholic countries. But ironically, the only effect that had was they couldn't mass produce their own information. So the world was being flooded with Protestant theology, and nobody was reading Catholic theology because you couldn't get a hands on a copy of a Catholic book. So it was kind of ironic. They kind of shot themselves in the foot. Yeah. So it's an interesting point. Yeah. Any other final thoughts or questions before we close up our time tonight? Well, thank you, folks. I've certainly had a lot of fun. It's been wonderful journeying with you through part 1 of this lecture series, and I do hope you come and join us tomorrow for part 2, 1 o'clock, same time, not same time, same place, 1 o'clock tomorrow. So God's peace and safe travels home tonight, and thanks for coming.